Welcome back to day 13 of the Bible in 365. I'm happy to have you guys here with me today. Today we are going to explore Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 25 and going all the way to Genesis chapter 40, ending in verse 8. Let's get started. All right, folks, so our story picks back up in Genesis chapter 37 in verse 25 with Joseph at the bottom of a cistern. At this point in time, his brothers are sitting down for a meal and they see a caravan of merchants that are headed towards Egypt coming in their direction. And one of the brothers, Judah, says, hey, why don't we actually, make something of this and let's sell our brother off to these merchants. And so that's what they do. They sell off Joseph as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. Now, at this point in time, Reuben comes back to the cistern with the hopes of rescuing Joseph, and he finds the cistern empty. And he says, the boy isn't here. Where can I turn now? Kind of like, what has become of me? What am I going to do? And so the brothers get Joseph's robe. They slaughter a goat and dip the robe in blood. And so they come back to their father and they say, we found this. Examine it to see if it's your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some furious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. And so Jacob tore his robes, put on sackcloth, and mourns the loss of his son. Here the robe is significant because we see that the robe, which is a robe, is meant to conceal and to hide things. And we see here that is concealing and hiding the truth of what really happened to Joseph from his father, Jacob. Now it tells us that at this point in time, the merchants arrived in Egypt and they sold Joseph off to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials who was the captain of the guard. Chapter 38 tells us that Judah leaves his brothers and goes and marries himself the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. Shua provides for him 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Selah. Now Judah goes and looks for a wife for his firstborn, for Er. And he finds this woman named Tamar. Now at this point in time, it tells us that Er was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord put him to death. Now we don't know what Er did, but it was an error, obviously. A little Bible humor for you there. And so the Lord put him to death. Now Onan had a responsibility as the brother-in-law to provide an heir for Tamar. And he does not do that. He's not willing to do that. And so the Lord finds that to be wicked and puts him to death. At this point in time, Judah says to Tamar, go live in your father's household as a widow. I don't know if my 3rd son is going to live long enough to provide for you an heir, but when he's old enough, we will try. And so she goes and lives as a widow. So our story picks back up in verse 12 of chapter 38. Here it tells us that Shua, Judah's wife, had passed away. Judah goes through the grieving process, then goes up to Timnah, where the men are shearing his sheep. Tamar finds out about this, takes off her widow's garments, disguises herself with a veil. When Judah comes to her on the road, he believes she's a prostitute, asks to sleep with her. She agrees in return for a goat. He sends for the goat, but in the meantime gives her his seal, cord, and staff as collateral. Now he sleeps with her, she becomes pregnant, and she leaves. At this point in time, he looks for her. He asks, where's this prostitute so that I could pay her what is due? He can't find her, and so he kind of just laughs it off. He got to keep his goat. Now some time has passed, and he finds out that Tamar is pregnant. And at this point in time, he says, bring her out, let her be burned to death for her crimes. She comes out and pretty much says, hey, remember these things that you gave me? He says, she's righteous, don't put her to death. And he realizes his mistake, that he hadn't given her Selah as promised to provide her an heir. Now at this point in time, the chapter 38 ends by telling us that Tamar conceives and gives birth to 2 sons, to twins. Our story continues in Genesis chapter 39. Here the biblical text shifts our attention back to Joseph, who is in Egypt in Potiphar's house. Now it tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, and so Joseph prospered. Potiphar took attention to this and put Joseph in charge of his household, in control of everything he owned. And so it says the Lord blessed the household as a result. Now in verse 6, it tells us that Joseph was well built and very handsome, and that Potiphar's wife tried to sleep with him. Joseph said no, that he would be a fool for doing such. But it tells us in verse 11, one day he went into the house, and Potiphar's wife caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand, and he ran out of the house. When she saw that he left his cloak, she went outside and she told a lie, and she said, "Look, this Hebrew has been brought here to make sport of us. He tried to sleep with me. He tried to rape me." And so Potiphar believes the lie. So here we see that, similar to the robe that Joseph's brothers presented to Jacob, their father, to conceal the truth regarding what really happened to Joseph, we see that Potiphar's wife presents the cloak to conceal, to hide, to cloak the truth from Potiphar. And so once again, Potiphar believes the lie. He gets angry and furious with Joseph and throws him into the king's dungeon, into prison. Now here the chapter ends with a bit of hope. It tells us that the Lord was with Joseph while he was in prison. And so the warden of the prison took favor on Joseph and put him in charge of the prison. And it says that the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. We see this common theme. Joseph, when he was in Potiphar's house, and now Joseph in prison, has success because the Lord is with him and the Lord blesses him in everything that he does. So our story continues in Genesis chapter 40. It says, "Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt defended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials and put them in custody of the house captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. So the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and Joseph attended them." The story goes on to tell us that both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king, who were being held in prison, had a dream. And each dream had a meaning of its own. Now it tells us Joseph comes to them the next morning because they were dejected. And so we asked them, "Why do you look so sad today?" Their response is, "We both had dreams, but there's no one left here to interpret them." And Joseph says to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." It is here, after Joseph has instructed these two officials to tell them their dreams, that our reading ends for today. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today. I hope you will join me for tomorrow's reading as we take a look at Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 9, and reading all the way to Genesis chapter 42, ending in verse 28. God bless.